encouragement and a help to the work of First Christian today. Amen.
Amen.
Peter, before we get started, is it all right that I record this?
Yeah.
Okay. That way, Rick, then we can share it beyond within the congregation.
Thanks, Tim. That's great. I love it. Well, I don't think I need to really introduce Peter. I think I said the most important things. He's pastor at the Albany Mennonite Church. He's from Canada, so he has some experience that's really important with universal healthcare in Canada. And I'm hoping that people will be interested in learning about the Canadian system as an example of a universal healthcare system. And then we'll be talking in future sessions about other systems, such as the Taiwan system. We'll also have a session on Medicare and Medicare supplements, Medicare Advantage, and why we have such a complicated Medicare system when Canada's got a pretty simple one, and what some of the advantages might be of a universal healthcare system, whether it's Medicare for all or something else. So that's a little bit more than talking about you, Peter. Sorry about that. But I did want to make sure that your congregants know they're welcome to future sessions also to talk about those things. So you were going to just mention some main features of the Canadian system to get the conversation started?
That sounds great. I'd be glad to do that. Yeah. I'll start by saying I think Rick's already alluded to this. I'm not an expert on the Canadian healthcare system, though I am a Canadian who lived in Canada for most of my years. So I am, of course, also experienced my care in Canada as a white person of means who has been blessed not to have a lot of major health crises in my own life. So I can't speak on behalf of every Canadian this morning, this afternoon. But I'm happy to tell you a little bit of my experience and maybe especially highlight what I've noticed in living on both sides of the border about some of the things that I guess I would say I miss about the Canadian healthcare system, or just see as different and probably are missed by people who are in different situations than I am. I jotted down 7 things that I could think of. I'm sure I could think of more if I spent even more time. And I'll just start in no particular order with what those 7 things are, and where I can, I'll provide a brief personal story or example from my own life. So the first thing I jotted down, I don't know why I put it at the top of the list because I had run out of room at the bottom of my page, and then I thought of it later and added it to the top. And that is the phrase pre-existing conditions. It strikes me that the phrase pre-existing conditions would not exist in my vocabulary if I, as a Canadian, when I lived in Canada, did not consume a lot of American media, which most Canadians do. So most Canadians know now what the phrase pre-existing conditions means, but it's a pretty foreign term to us. Of course, that's because we live in a system where it doesn't matter when or how or where you have an injury or an ailment. There's in the universal healthcare system as it is in Canada, the timing does not matter. You were signed up for this healthcare when you were born. So there is really no such thing as a pre-existing condition. And just in terms of where the rubber hits the road, sometimes I think about actually the very day that I was moving to Albany. I had been, Shanda and the kids, you've got a beautiful picture of down there. They were already out here. I had stayed behind to load up one of those pods, those big sort of metal boxes to move all of our stuff. And I got one of my most athletic friends to help me, and I'm very glad I did. But I still somehow woke up that morning of leaving after having been working all day loading this thing, feeling like I had likely re-injured a hernia that I had repaired maybe 4 or 5 years before. It was that part of my body was just very painful that morning. And I remember panicking because I did not know if I was going to arrive here and my healthcare would start here. and if that would be considered a pre-existing condition. And I didn't know my Affordable Care Act well enough to know whether or not, in fact, would this be something that my new healthcare would cover? I know that it would have, but as a Canadian watching American news, you're just conscious that the concept of pre-existing conditions tends to be constantly in flux, and you never really know where it stands. And I imagine even for a lot of Americans who are less probably on top of these things than this group, some of them would struggle to know right now, right? Are all my pre-existing conditions covered? Will they be for much longer? That's a big question right now, right? And so I had to schedule an emergency meeting with my doctor to meet with him, who thankfully informed me that while the pain I was experiencing might be connected to my hernia repair, I did not in fact need surgery for this, that likely the muscles would recover on their own. But that experience on the day of my moving here reminded me of just the fact that in Canada, we don't worry about whether or not the government will or won't take away our access to healthcare if we have a pre-existing condition. That just does not exist. The second thing I thought of that, of course, I think is a pretty talked about one down here is just preventative care. I'll reference a few times in this. Shanda and I, when we were first married, lived in Portland, Oregon, Shanda's from Minnesota. So she grew up in the US, but from 2007 to 2010, we lived in Portland as a young couple moving there originally without jobs, the whole thing that we all did too many of us did when we were young. Of course, I didn't have health care. I was a teacher at the time. When until I got a full-time teaching job, I didn't have any health care, and there was no way I would ever have gone to the doctor until that contract came. Whereas in Canada, you just went to your regular appointments, of course. I won't pretend I did a great job of that in my 20s, but most Canadians do, and it's something certainly when we went back when I was older and more cognizant of my health, you just did. Whereas I knew from experience in the US, you don't even make an appointment if you don't have health care unless you really, really need to. Another big thing I appreciate in the Canadian system is the direct accountability to voters on healthcare. Now, of course, here our candidates will a big part of their platforms will be healthcare, but those connections there's more steps between those connections, right? So when we left Manitoba, I won't paint a perfect picture of the Canadian healthcare system, because in that case, a Conservative government had won in my home province, and they had gutted the budget for the healthcare system. But you knew that if their claims that giving less to the healthcare system, if their claims were wrong, that they could get away with giving less without damaging care, that people could just simply vote them out when their time around came. It wasn't the connection between them as politicians and the budget for healthcare was very direct. Rather than here, right, when you had the Affordable Care Act go through, you have to go, there's all kinds of, it's not just a matter of how much the government puts in the budget, right, to decide the government's impact on healthcare. They have to wade into that big old mess that Obama waded into, and that Trump has been unable to navigate himself for his own goals. Let's see, what else I would say? Oh, in terms of accountability, the other thing I would say is that there's only one tier of healthcare in Canada, and it's accessible to everybody. And in Canada, we will use the phrase two-tiered healthcare sometimes, because the Conservative parties in Canada have at times proposed what is called a two-tiered healthcare system, where some can pay if they want to, and others would continue to access universal care. That's been rejected by Canadian voters time and again. I think because the understanding is that if we all receive the same healthcare, if we're all in the same healthcare system, those with more means and socio-political influence, socioeconomic influence, if they want better healthcare, they have to find ways for the healthcare to be better for everyone. So you don't have a system for the rich and a system for the poor with a growing gap in between them. So I won't tell you that the healthcare system in Canada is perfect. But what I do know is that where there is room for improvement, that improvement has to be met. That improvement happens for everybody when it happens. It doesn't just happen for the few who can pay for it. And actually, just quickly on a note, I haven't looked in a long time at the World Health Organization rankings. But when I taught in Portland around 2010, I had a lot of people asking me a lot of questions at that time. And I remember looking it up and seeing, when I talk about the healthcare system in Canada not being perfect, I will say in the World Health Organization's rankings, Canada is not listed near the top of the world, but every other major country ahead of Canada also has some type of more accessible healthcare system than the US does, some version of a universal healthcare system at the time, at least when I looked at it. So I was also glad to hear you're looking at other countries too, because I don't know that we are the best example. But I also noticed that the US was ranked lower than Canada was, which would be true of my experience too. Me saying that I won't say we're the best is not a coded way of saying I think the healthcare is worse in Canada than it is here. I think it is better, but I also won't paint an idyllic picture for you either. There are occasionally issues with wait lists for some some procedures that are non-emergency. You might wait longer in some cases than you would here, and of course, but not nearly as long as people down here who are getting paid as lobbyists will have you think. Those few stories in Canada, there's people down here paid a lot of money, is my understanding, to tell you those very few stories, and to keep those in the media much longer here than all the success stories in Canada. All right, I'll keep moving down my list here. Sense of security is a pretty obvious one too. Just to add to, when I moved to Portland, I quickly became a substitute teacher, and it seemed insane to me to realize that if I wanted to stay a substitute teacher, I was finding a lot of work as a substitute teacher. I would never have received healthcare in that role. I still cannot wrap my mind around the fact that our school system, which relies on substitute teachers, like that, an absolutely essential employee for the teaching of the children in this nation, is something you can only do if you want to risk living without healthcare. And so also in terms of, so the sense of security that can empower people to do different kinds of work exists in Canada, whereas here there are certain kinds of work that are very necessary for our society. But why would you do that if you're giving up potential health care? So I would also add to that the fact that Albany here has a wonderful Mennonite village. When we moved here, and we've got 2 kids and another one on the way, I would love for my parents to move here. I was ready to send them all the brochures for the village, which is quite frankly a better setup than anything near where they live. But it was a non-question. They would never consider moving at their age. They're both in their 70s. The sacrifices they would make for their health care and the potential costs for them would be just insurmountable in their minds, and rightfully so. Just also, that's sort of my experience with that sense of security, that my own, my parents would never, as much as they would love maybe to be closer to us, they wouldn't even consider it because of the differences in healthcare costs. Lastly, I'll just say one that maybe I only realized in the last 2 years when I came to Albany Mennonite, would be that the concept of accessibility to healthcare does not seem to be pitted against, well, maybe pitting against is the wrong phrase, but here, whether by perception or reality, there is a fear out there that the Affordable Care Act is burdensome to small businesses, small organizations like my church. Now, I don't know how much of that is bluster and fear mongering, but I do know that I know a lot of people here who believe that the Affordable Care Act had some real flaws when it came, or at least created some real problems for small businesses who could not afford to pay for the health care of their employees, and so had to do some layoffs or lost their business. In the worst cases, you hear those stories down here at least. When I came down here and was an employee of a church that I know has a limited budget, thankfully Shanda, my partner, has good health care through OHA where she works. But if she hadn't, I would be aware that I would be placing a financial burden on my congregation to give me health care. I know full well like that the plan they would give me would not be great and would cost them a lot of money. And so I also just appreciate, and I know that in my case, my congregation would have given their pastors health care before the Affordable Care Act as well. But I do know that there are some out there who are saying that they are struggling they struggle between the questions of giving their employees health care versus being able to stay afloat as a business. That is not a question in Canada either. That's not a struggle that you have. So those off the top of my head, at least, would be the things I would mention. I would welcome your thoughts and questions and open it up to that, or however else Rick wants to direct this conversation.
Well, those are some excellent points. Thanks, Peter. And
Yeah.
that's what comes from having that kind of personal experience. I wouldn't have thought of some of those things. I'd just like to throw it open to anybody who has any questions about anything.
I would like to know a little bit more about your change in administrations and what changes in your health insurance that change created.
Yeah. Canadians will, I would say that the changes compared to here must be more minor, because people will talk about the healthcare budget for the province. So in Canada, each province gets, with money that's given to them by the federal government, funds the healthcare for the province, which would be, province is the equivalent of state here, right? In Canada, there are conversations about, when there's a change in administration in a province, healthcare is certainly, the healthcare budget is certainly a conversation, how that new administration will, how much funding they will give to the healthcare system and how that might play out. But there isn't anything near the deep fears around healthcare that I see here when it comes in a national election. In the 2016 election, people being very fearful or very happy to hear a promise that the Affordable Care Act would be revoked. I mean, I have never seen any of the changes based on changes in administration in Canada come anything close to the change that happened with the Affordable Care Act and to the change that would happen if the Affordable Care Act was revoked.
Are there discrepancies in the provinces as far as the amount of healthcare available to the citizens in each province?
I can't say for sure. I would need to look more at some things to know how to answer that for sure. There is certainly some, since it is province led, but in Canada, you very rarely hear. I don't think I have ever heard somebody, maybe that's exaggerated, but I can't really remember people ever talking about, oh, the healthcare is better in Ontario or the healthcare is better in Saskatchewan. That is, I think, in part because Canada has a more federalist system. So what you will hear is some of the richer provinces complaining that they are sending too much money to the federal government, which is getting shared too freely with the provinces that have worse economies or more struggling economies. So that would be something you'd be more likely to hear. But I do think that, in Canada, of course, there is a big dividing line between those who live closer to the border in the more populated areas and those who live in the northern, more remote reaches of Canada. of Canada, some of which you can't even really reach by road all of the time. And there are all kinds of inequalities, and also the northern communities are often indigenous or indigenous or Native American communities too, which also they get less than they should in general up there. That is a problem in Canada. But I would say that probably a universal healthcare system is making it more likely that they are getting doctors out there in the first place. Shanda, you might be able to speak to that better than me, though.
Yeah, there's no comparison in the States to the northern communities.
Right.
So, but it is true that I think probably access is better because it's nationalized, but it is also true that folks in northern communities who need a lot of what would feel like basic care end up having to move into the city centers and leave their communities in order to get the care they need, if there's any sort of serious care needed. Which continues to be a conversation, but there's no comparison to northern communities in the States, because we just don't have communities here that you have to fly into that are completely, I mean, you think Winnipeg is north, but you can drive 24 hours straight north and still not be to the top of Manitoba when the roads run out, and there's still people living up there. So I don't know if there's a comparison. There definitely is a difference province to province in how they choose to spend some of that money, like in long-term care. There was some differences province to province, but I wouldn't say massive gaps.
Shanda, by the way, was a social worker at a long-term care facility in Winnipeg, and now does suicide prevention and intervention for Oregon Health Authority. So she's got some perspectives on health, on healthcare in both countries that she can speak to that I can't. I did realize I forgot one thing on my list, though. I saved it for last because it was so exciting, and then I forgot to say it. Last thing, I will say unified, coordinated response to COVID. This is, I would never have thought about that. And I don't think I even caught the difference until Shanda started noticing it. But if you remember back when in sort of the beginning, when we first started getting COVID tests, I don't know about you, but it seemed like us and anyone we do didn't even know where you would go to get a COVID test here. And COVID was already running rampant in this country. My parents were living back in Manitoba, where there were only, I think, 12 or there were like a sliver of the cases of COVID there at the same time that there were here. And already there, the government had put out clear communication to everybody. These are all the COVID testing sites in the province. This is the number to call. This is the website to go to. These are the addresses. Because the government's response to COVID was meshed right in with the medical system already. And so you didn't have wondering, okay, well, I'm Kaiser Permanente. Do they have a testing location? Are they doing testing? What, all of the questions we had that I think Shanda and I really noticed, oh yeah, I guess this is what you have when it's just a bunch of companies deciding these things independently, and where their accountability is to the bottom line, not to the social good. So that was one more thing I want to say I would never have thought of until COVID, but the Canadian response is just so much more unified and coordinated and clear, which also partly has to do with who your administration is in this country. I also understand that I'm not comparing it to the best possible scenario in the US either, which maybe isn't fair.
Could you discuss pharmaceuticals? It says here that I'm reading that Canada is the only country in the world that has a national universal medical insurance program, but no equivalent drug plan, otherwise known as Pharmacare. How does that work there?
Yeah, it's not the best feature of our system. So to a lot of people who only know that Canada has universal healthcare don't know that it does not have universal pharmaceutical care, vision care, or dental care. And so those are all things that you get as supplementary insurance through your employer in Canada. So you get into many of the same situations you would here with those in those areas that you would with healthcare in general here. I don't know the reasons why. I don't know all the details, but I do know that Canada seems to have a better reputation for being able to keep the prices of its pharmaceuticals in line. But I don't know why or how that is. I just know that there was a while where Americans were ordering their pharmaceuticals from Canada. You all probably remember that. So.
And there are programs you can apply for to get Pharmacare aid or to get your pharmaceuticals covered. Sorry, my children are very loud. But there is assistance available for folks who are lower income.
And that's one of the things that varies from province to province, according to the government's website.
Mm.
The only reason why we hired Peter at Albany Mennonite was that he came with children, so we'll accept the noise.
I thought you were going to say because he came with a partner who had health insurance somewhere else.
Is that why my church hired me too? Because that's my case.
I will say, honestly, though, I was really conscious of it. In Canada, you would never think about it. But here, when we were talking about my contract, I was really conscious of the fact that I knew that Albany Mennonite could feel free to be more generous with my contract because, I mean, they could never say, we're going to give you a lower salary because we have to pay for your healthcare. They would never say that because they're good people and they don't want to think about it that way. But I do know that it was true on the flip side that because I had healthcare, I knew that I could sense that they can have a more generous spirit about it. And I just wish, of course, that wouldn't have to be a factor.
Can you speak to mental health care? Because that's a huge problem here, even though it's supposed to be included.
Yeah. If my kids were behaving, Shanda would probably answer that better than. Do you want to speak to that, Shanda?
Mental health care is included in national health care. There's a lot of problems and
Sorry, Shanda.
probably, but I would say it's a part of
We can't hear you. We can't hear you at all now, Shanda. Can you hear me? I'll go talk to her. No, I don't. Anyway, I'm not sure why we can't hear you, Shannon. It doesn't look like you're muted, but yeah, so healthcare is, but it's not a perfect system is the short answer. Mental health. I don't know if I said mental health, but yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah.
So Peter, one of my frustrations with my plan that is through my wife who works in Tualatin, so in the Portland Metro, is that sometimes my doctors here, I can find doctors here that will be under my plan and sometimes I won't. And so that I find that I have opted because after a few false starts and ending up with a huge surprise bill, that I have to, I just drive up there, which if I'm really sick is going to be a real annoyance. I haven't had anything since I've been here that I had to do that. What if you are out of your province or out of your area? What is it like in the Canadian system? So
it's all totally fluid. You don't, unless you're crossing the border into the US, you don't ever think about going to the wrong place and not being covered. I don't know how they've worked that out from province to province, but I know that Canadians buy health insurance to come down to the U.S., as Michael Moore fans here will know well, but they don't ever think about it going from province to province. Yeah, and I would agree. I mean, it's absurd to me that we live in Albany. We won't be able to give birth in our own city, which has a hospital, because we have the wrong insurance, you know, and we go up to Portland to do ultrasounds that could be done, I assume could be done somewhere closer by. And so just not for all our ultrasounds, but for some of the bigger ones. So, but anyway, yeah, the inefficiencies in the system are pretty obvious.
I think it's just heart paining that it's so hard.
Yeah.
And that, you know, being reasonably affluent, reasonably educated, I can make it work if I work hard at it. But for anybody who's working 2-3 jobs, or I don't know how they do it.
Yeah.
Especially 2 or 3 jobs and still no insurance.
Yeah, and I don't think you can even put a number. I mean, we can't really grasp just the emotional baggage, right, of carrying around questions about your own healthcare. Because the truth is, Canadians do pay for their healthcare through their taxes, right? Like it's not free in that sense, but it is the way they do it is incredibly freeing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't see a whole bunch of Canadians moving to the US because life is so much better here.
Yeah, we did. Well, we moved here, but we were a lot of people calling us crazy.
Yeah, but you know what I mean.
Yeah,
Totally. Not a thing.
Yeah, I will say to feel like I'm giving you at least a picture of the other side of it. There are American conservative politicians who will say, well, Canada does have a 2-tiered healthcare system. Their second tier is coming to the U.S. to pay for it if they can afford it. And I will say that I know people who have done that. It's not something that never happens. There are, if you're a Canadian who there's a procedure that you disagree with your doctor about how urgent that procedure is, or if you're an anxious person who wants it done right away. I think Canada's pretty good with if you really do need it right away, it happens. But people who really want something done right away and probably would and could get it done more quickly down here do sometimes come down here and pay for it. And so that is a reality.
Mm-hmm.
People talk a lot about, well, you must be paying a fortune in taxes then. Can you speak to the tax burden for your total taxes and maybe some of the other things that are social services that are covered in Canada that aren't covered here in the United States by your taxes?
Yeah, I'm not the right person to ask about even my own. I don't track very well how much more in taxes I'm paying here than there. But I do know that our lifestyle is not massively different on either side of the border. So I think we probably do pay. I mean, the sales tax in Manitoba is 13%, so that is very different than Oregon. But the income tax here also is pretty big hit, or opportunity to contribute to society, I guess, if you want to look at it like that. I think that Canadians probably must pay more taxes. And yeah, you do. And you will hear of Canadians who want to, there are Canadians who are very frustrated that they get taxed too much. But overall, Canadians are very proud of their healthcare system and will rare. Yeah, you don't often hear anybody talking about how it's not, they're paying too much in taxes for the health care that they receive. This isn't a very formal way to look at it, but I know that maybe about 12 years ago or so, Canada did this. Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, so our national media outlet, did a competition just for fun, but of who's the greatest Canadian of all time, and they got, I mean, there was a John A. Macdonald, who's our equivalent of George Washington, and Pierre Trudeau, perhaps, the only Canadian prime minister that most people here would know by name. I know you all would probably know others, but that most people in the US know. I mean, just really, really famous Canadians. And in the end, the guy who won the competition was a guy named Tommy Douglas, who ran again and again and again to be prime minister and never won. But he ran on the platform of universal health care. And eventually, the Liberal Party adopted that platform and won and implemented it. And Canadians have never forgotten that Tommy Douglas first put it on the political agenda. And so, based on that almost alone, he was voted by the Canadian people the greatest Canadian of all time. Failed politician, simply because he got the ball rolling on universal healthcare. So I think that's pretty telling about at least the value Canadians seem to feel they get from it. But Shanda, I noticed you unmuted for a second there. Did you want to talk about taxes or cost? No.
For mental health.
We definitely paid more taxes, but you also don't have the stress of worrying about your healthcare. And I would say the social service system is like infinitely better. It's infinitely more dignified, I would say. Like there's not it's just built to be more respectful of humans. And it's just a little bit more built in, such that you're not going to like separate offices and standing in line and having to constantly vouch that you deserve this. So it's just it's not as much hoop jumping, and there's not as much, which is really, it's a nice thing to know as somebody living in that system and paying what would have been a little bit more tax. It's nice to know that people are also being taken care of better than they are here. There's not that system of sort of relying on nonprofits. The government takes care of more of it. So as a social worker, when we moved to Winnipeg, or to Manitoba, I was very confused by that at first. Like, where are all the nonprofits? Like, I'm supposed to be applying to work at all these nonprofits, and I can't. And I realized after a while, it's like, oh, it's because the government's taking care of its people. So there's not there's not lines of people standing in all these different services to get, this pot of money or these couple cans of food, and there's not all these nonprofits competing for little grants here and there. So that also makes it feel more. It just is a big difference in the feeling of the place that you live in when you know folks are being taken care of in a more systematic way. Do
you want to say more about the healthcare that you were talking about before, Shanda?
No, I would just say that mental health care is covered, but there's a lot of room for improvement. Where we lived, there was mobile crisis, there was like ongoing therapy available, but not super widely, and people would say there was not enough of it. I think it was better than what we have here, and again, because it was more systematic, it was run in a more overarching, connected way, but still some pretty sizable gaps. And for folks who had employers with that extra package with vision, dental, and pharmacy, often some extra mental health care would be part of that as well. So like counseling might be covered as part of that package from your employer.
I'll just highlight the thing Shanda said about jumping through hoops too. Shanda and I are not on the same page as her parents about universal health care. And one of the funniest things I've heard her parents talk about, is the idea that if they just don't want to have to do more paperwork, like we already have to do enough paperwork for the government, we can't imagine doing more paperwork for the government. And it would, I do paperwork for healthcare down here all the time. In Canada, I walk in and show a card and walk out. That's it. Like they don't send me a bill. They don't send me a receipt. They don't send me like you get sent a card by the government and you just show that to people. And that's the extent of the paperwork of the jumping through hoops in Canada.
And to get that card, it's a very short piece of paper to fill out. If you're new to the province, it is a very short piece of paper that you can fill out within 30 days of arriving there.
Yeah. So the myth that a more socialist system is somehow also more bureaucratic and sends you all kinds of different lines and forms and all of that, that has been the opposite of our experience.
It seems to me from some reading I've done that there's much more to this, because these are statistics way back from 2006, but U.S. per capita spending for healthcare was like 23% higher than in Canada and way higher than anywhere in the world. So actually we are paying, if I'm correct, paying more in our taxes than anywhere else. It's just, I guess, our healthcare system consumes a lot of money. And maybe it's broken.
Well, that's between taxes and our out-of-pocket expenses. That's true. We are spending quite a bit more.
Yeah, you are paying for your healthcare and your taxes here too, aren't you? It's just more hidden.
And then there's our military budget, but that's another topic.
Yeah, don't get the Mennonites going on that.
I'm with you.
It is a question of values, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting. Shanda would also notice, though, the areas in which other areas of government spending seem to be much less in Canada. For example, on roads. Like you drive into Canada, we lived in just north of North Dakota, so lest you picture us having lived in a beautiful place in Canada. Don't worry, healthcare was good. Where we lived was just like uglier and colder than North Dakota. But when you cross the border from North Dakota and Canada, you would literally go from a smooth highway to like what felt like it must have been through a war recently. So I don't know. I mean, that's just anecdotal, but it does seem like there are a few areas where you sometimes notice like, oh, I guess our government must prioritize spending on, say, our healthcare because they're not spending it on the roads.
Can you tell us a little bit more about how pharmaceuticals work? You mentioned that prices seem to be cheaper, but anything you tell us about the burden on the average Canadian for healthcare expense? How much is insurance for pharmaceuticals or anything?
Yeah, I can't say much. It hasn't been a big part of my own experience. I do know that it's a regular part of the insurance you get through your employer. And I do know that folks who don't have that insurance sometimes find themselves in very American-like situations. That is the one place where you hear about Canadians having health crises and saying like, I can't hold this drug, but I would go bankrupt to buy it.
So like cancer treatment would be pretty.
Yeah. So I mean, this includes things like cancer treatments. There are folks who, if they don't have insurance, are really behind the 8 ball on paying for cancer treatment. Yeah. So it is a real hole in the system to say that you give somebody health care, but then things like cancer need pharmaceuticals, right? And if that's not covered, then are you really covering their care? So yeah.
Okay.
If you're hospitalized, though, your pharmaceuticals are covered. Like if you're in care, if you're inpatient, then your pharmaceuticals are covered. And there are situations where you get recommended for a certain level of care and you don't particularly want that level of care, but if you want it to be covered, you have to sort of either appeal that or accept the level of care that's been, if you want coverage. So if you are saying, I'd like to go home and be at home, but you've been assessed at a level of care that requires being inpatient, if you want coverage, you almost have to be willing to go inpatient to get the coverage. That's not always true. There are appeals you can do, but there are situations that come up like that, and especially where I worked in aging and disabilities, that we would have to go to bat for folks sometimes, where they would say like, no, I think this can be done in my home, and so I think there would be, there's challenges in this as well.
So it is possible to go bankrupt for medical expenses in Canada.
Yeah.
So I like this quote. Most Canadians are content that their health care may not be the best in the world, but at least they're better than the U.S. That's all that really matters.
I will say Canadians do have an unhealthy fixation with being better than the U.S. So if you want to find a flaw in Canadians, honestly, they are, as long as, like, if your healthcare were to get better than ours, I don't know, we would know what to do. Like, but as long as it's better, we'll accept whatever level it is. I mean, there's the Canadian ego is constantly comparing itself to the American. We're the little brother. Don't ever tell Canadians I called us that, but we have a little brother syndrome, or a little sister syndrome, whatever you want to call it.
So one way that the VA saves money by having a formulary for drugs. Is there a formulary in the VA that only authorizes certain drugs, or?
Shanda? She doesn't know. Okay. I would, there's no way I would know. Shanda is actually the care facility she worked at was filled with Canadian veterans, but yeah. But I guess they were getting their pharmaceuticals paid for because they were in care. So yeah.
And isn't that a separate system also, that they have their own veterans care that's a federal responsibility as opposed to a provincial one?
Yeah, veterans are covered. They often get care at the same places, but there's extra funding, so veterans don't have to pay for some things. Sorry, I got a real chattery one. Like in long-term care, veteran care is covered completely, whereas if you go into long-term care and you're not a veteran, there's a portion that has to be covered. It's sliding scale, so it depends on your income, but veterans do have added benefits. They'll usually receive care in the same places, as far as I ever saw.
That's true. I never thought about that till this moment, but in Canada, you never hear people worrying that the veterans aren't being taken care of. Like here, there's so much conversation about VA benefits, and yeah, because in Canada, they have access to the same care as everybody else. And then apparently, I didn't even know this, but then apparently the veteran care is just something added on top of that. So
yeah, and it was done behind the scenes. Like veterans never had to, or at least in my experience, veterans never had to vie for those things. Like we did that work behind the scenes as the care facility. We would say, oh, they're a veteran, so this, and this pays for it. It's not something they had to contend with.
So long-term care sounds like it's covered, where it's not here.
A portion is. So the part of long-term care that is medical care is totally covered. The part of long-term care that is considered like rent for housing, that part in Manitoba, at least, that is charged on a sliding scale. So the lowest rate was about, when I was working there, was about $32 a day. No, that was the higher end. The lower end was in the 20-something dollars a day. And it was sliding scale depending on your income. And if you couldn't make the rate that you were assessed at, then we would just argue to a lower rate. And it was designed to take in account, like if you had a partner that was still living in the house you owned, then that it would take that into account, that you couldn't sell your home and have access to that funds. And it was designed so that nobody would be paying their whole income for this long-term care. So it was a really, at least in my experience, it was a pretty kind system in that it took the whole picture into account as much as possible. And then it was my job to argue for
Because yeah, that alone can bankrupt families.
It's going to be a bigger and bigger problem.
Well, and I think what I see happening is it sometimes keeps people in situations that are not as healthy for them because they don't feel like they can afford it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and long-term care is going to be a huge issue. It's getting to be more and more of an issue now with our aging population, which is projected to just continue. So we have to figure out what we're going to do about that, and whether or not to include long-term care in the system is one of the big questions we'll be facing in Oregon as we look at the plan that they're talking about, or they're trying to design in the task force right now.
Yeah, there are hard questions in Canada too about whether or not our system will be able to handle the influx of boomers when that time comes. The math doesn't, honestly, the math, from what I've heard from folks from at least one person in local government, was that the math won't add up as the system currently is. And it seems a little unlikely that people will put in the effort to fix that problem until it's already a problem. So, yeah, Canadians will suffer from some of the same struggles too, I think.
There is coverage for at-home care as well. So when someone needs care, but they're not at a level of needing long-term care, home care is covered as well. And so there's an assessment process where they with OTs and PTs figure out how much care do you need, how often do you need it. And there was a big push when we were there in Manitoba to keep people at home as long as possible, partly because it was more affordable for everyone, but also because it's just healthier to be able to stay in your community as long as possible. So I would hope that push continues. And it was a really nice benefit. It wasn't flawless, but it was really nice that home care was covered as part of healthcare.
Okay, good.
Can you compare that to the situation in the United States with the coverage of Medicare and Medicaid?
It's super varies state to state. I know, like, my brother gets home care in Minnesota, and I think it also depends on whether what kinds of block grant states choose to engage in. So, like, my brother gets care. It's Medicaid, but it's under a certain block grant. It used to be one, and now it's a different one. And so I think it's states kind of piecemeal together how much they're going to cover of home health. I'm not sure what it is in Oregon, but my understanding of it is it varies pretty significantly from state to state, and every state kind of piecemeals money together to make some of it accessible.
Yeah.
But in the Canadian system, this is all covered by the Canadian Health Act, where it's a federal standard.
I think provinces can decide how they allocate that money, like how they assess the need and how much they're willing to. But yes, the medical piece of it is covered. So the part of it, and again, that there is always a charge if you're getting long-term inpatient care, so nursing home or chronic care. but yeah, the home health is covered. And again, I would guess there's some variation in how that's assessed and how that's covered from province to province, but yeah, that is covered.
So you can have any income and get in-home health care, as opposed to here, you have to be on Medicaid. Got it. That would make a big difference for a lot of people. Mhm.
So I would like to speak on behalf of my pastor. I know he loved coming here and doing this, but as part of his congregation, I think it's time for him to go spend time with his family. And I think we've run this conversation through, and it was a lovely conversation. I'm not complaining at all, but it's my job as his congregant and part of leadership to say he needs a break now and go be with his family. So if that's okay, I don't want to be bossy here.
Thank you, Peter, for doing
I'll
this.
say any more questions. If there's, I'd be happy to answer one. If somebody's got a burning question, thanks, Phil. Although I am also very happy to be here. This was good, and super glad that Shanda joined. She probably should have been your guest of honor since she knows she can answer a lot of these questions better than I can. Any question for any other questions for either of us or both of us?
Well, I want to thank Shanda for coming too. I was really, I found a lot of your information very helpful.
Yeah.
Thank both of you.
Thank you all. So
Yeah,
much.
for sure.
Thank you all very, very much.
Very much.
Very informative.
Very good talk.
Oh, good. I'm glad. It's good to be with you all in these COVID times too. It feels good to connect with other faces from Albany right now.
Well, and maybe as two churches, Peter, we should find ways to do more things together.
I think
we are very like-minded in lots of ways.
we are very like-minded. I agree. Yeah. No, if we have a kindred spirit congregation in town, I'm pretty sure it's you. So we should nurture that more.
And we could change youth to all the things you need to be fixed on,
Oh,
like us.
That did not come from the pastor of the congregation.
renegade.
We'll be preaching on Mennonite humility
What
next.
the-
Just never take me too seriously.
Well, Peter, we'll include you on our list when we send out announcements for future meetings. They're every other week at the same
Okay.
time.
Well, I think they're
that was
second and they're twice a month, right?
They've been every other week.
I think we decided on two specific Sundays. Well, we'll figure this out. And
We'll
let you
figure it
know.
out. You'll be on the list. And you don't need to worry about it.
All right. Well, thank you all for the work that you're doing for our community and for inviting us here and for the good fellowship today. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Blessings to
All right.
you all.
Okay. Bye all.
Bye.